Welcome to part 3 of Santa Barbara's Channel Islands through vintage postcards and photographs. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. In parts 1 and 2, we explored Santa Barbara, Anacapa, Santa Rosa, and San Miguel, 4 of the 5 islands in the Channel Islands National Park. This presentation will focus on the 5th, the largest and most diverse island, Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is the largest island in California. With over 96 square miles, it supports a variety of flora and fauna on its 62,000 acres. Its woodlands of pine and oak on the north shore, the arid desert-like south, and many of its geological features combine to make the island a microcosm of California. Being 24 miles long and 6 miles wide, it is nearly 3 times the size of Manhattan. The island has a large central valley rimmed by 2 rugged mountain ranges. The highest peak, Mount Diablo, rises 2,450 feet. There are steep cliffs, beaches, and over 100 sea caves are found on the island. With a number of microclimates, the island supports more than 600 plant species in an environment of mountains, valleys, marshes, grasslands, and chaparral. 8 plant species are found only on Santa Cruz and nowhere else in the world. The island's woodlands are widespread, with coast live oak found on north-facing slopes and in shaded canyons. Aggregates of bishop pine are numerous and are also found on north-facing slopes. Ironwood trees grow mostly on rocky slopes or ridge tops with well-drained gravelly soils. The island is home to only 4 native mammals: the island fox, the spotted skunk, and the deer and western harvest mice. The number of reptile and amphibian species is likewise low and includes 4 lizards, 1 salamander, 1 frog, and 2 non-venomous snakes. Land birds endemic to Santa Cruz include the western meadowlark, the rock wren, Allen's hummingbird, the horned lark, the housefinch, the orange-crowned warbler, and the Pacific flycatcher. The rufous-crowned and song sparrows and the Santa Cruz scrub jay are found nowhere else in the world. The island provides a habitat for large colonies of nesting bird species, including owls, merlins, grosbeaks, orioles, and larks. Seabirds abound, with western gulls, California brown pelicans, and cormorants. Black oyster catchers with their bright red bills and pink feet feed along the beach. The Santa Cruz Island horse was brought to the island from Spain in 1830. They lived relatively undisturbed in a semi-feral environment for nearly 200 years. Through natural selection, they remained a hardy breed and genetically distinct from the horses that remained on the mainland. They played a key role in the ranching operations. Heavy draft horses were used for plowing and pulling wagons. Saddle horses for roundups and to maintain communications, and a pair were used as carriage horses. At the peak of the ranching era, there were 129 horses on the island. In 1998, the breed was removed and a breeding program to conserve the species was launched at El Campeon Farms in Thousand Oaks, California. With 77 miles of coastline, Santa Cruz Island supports large numbers of breeding seals, sea lions, and other marine animals. Here is a postcard from the past. And current views of harbor seals frolicking and snoozing about the island. Sea lions and elephant seals also find the island home. The sea otter, with 1 million hairs per square inch, was treasured for its warm fur. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hunters like George Nidever, who did his share by killing hundreds around Santa Cruz Island, nearly wiped them out. The numbers of California sea otters was reduced from approximately 16,000 to as few as 50 individuals in 1911. The southern sea otter was thought to have been eliminated, but in 1938, 50 or so were spotted in Big Sur. Since then, the California sea otter population has inched up to almost 3,000 from that remnant population of 50. The island is also rich in cultural history, with over 10,000 years of Native American habitation and over 150 years of European exploration and ranching. It was home to 10 villages that housed over 1,200 people. They developed a highly complex society dependent on marine harvest, craft specialization, and trade with mainland groups. For example, they mined extensive churd deposits for making tools and served as early bankers by producing shell bead money, used as a major trade item by tribes throughout California. They used large plank canoes called tomals to facilitate trade with the natives on the mainland. The Chumash had social hierarchies that featured an upper class of chiefs, shamans, boat builders, and artisans, a middle class of workers, fishermen, and hunters, and a lower class of the poor and outcast. This map shows the location of the main villages. The largest, Swaxil, occupied the area of Scorpion's Ranch when the Spanish first arrived here. This image displays two middens, or ancient refuge heaps, which give us insight into their presence as well as their diet. Remnants of the Chumash civilization can still be seen in thousands of shell middens located throughout the island. It is estimated that there are over 3,000 archaeological sites on Santa Cruz. In the upper left is a close-up of a midden. Upper right, Chumash shell money. Lower left, a Chumash necklace. And at right, a beautiful Chumash basket. In 1769, an expedition led by Gaspar de Portola for the King of Spain was the first to claim ownership of the island. The expedition was divided into two parts. The land expedition, led by Portola and Junipero Serra, and the seagoing exploration, led by Juan Perez, captain of the San Antonio. On board with Perez were Frays Francisco Gomez and Juan Vizcaino, not to be confused with Sebastian Vizcaino, who named the other Channel Islands some 200 years earlier. Passing several islands, the expedition landed to replenish supplies on what is now called Prisoner's Cove. Several missionaries met with friendly Indians who exchanged fish for strings of beads. Upon returning to the ship, they realized they had forgotten a walking staff with an iron cross on top. The next morning, as the ship was about to leave, and never expecting to see the staff again, a canoe approached the ship with a native holding the staff. Climbing on board, he delivered it to the priest. As a result, they named the island Santa Cruz, or Island of the Holy Cross. By the early 1820s, the last of the island Chumash had moved to the mainland, many to the missions at Santa Ynez, San Buenaventura, and Santa Barbara. Santa Cruz Island lay deserted for several years. Only fishermen, Chinese abalone divers, hunters, and travelers, including our old friend George Nidever, stopped by or squatted on its shores. After gaining independence from Spain in 1821, the Mexican government wished to expand its presence and increase its population in Alta California. They planned on populating many areas by relocating convicted criminals. Around 40 prisoners were sent to Santa Barbara, where, upon arrival, they were not accepted and whisked away to Santa Cruz. They lived for a short time in the area today known as Prisoners Harbor. Again, a decade later, a ship dropped anchor off Santa Barbara seeking permission to discharge its cargo, a boatload of some 80 convicted criminals, as part of a Mexican plan to establish a penal colony. The cargo of convicts was again redirected to Santa Cruz. 5 years later, a fire destroyed the penal camp colony. Building rafts from whatever material was at hand, the men attempted to escape the island and head for the mainland. Without sails or any oars or paddles to speak of, they were at the mercy of wind and currents and might have drifted endlessly if not for a storm that eventually pushed some of them ashore in the area of Carpinteria. They were rounded up in fairly short order and imprisoned for a time. Eventually, they were released and were absorbed into society. Through a Mexican land grant, Andre Castillero was the first individual to own the island. After 18 years of ownership, he sold to William Barron, who transferred it to a consortium of 10 men that have formed the Santa Cruz Island Company. Justinian Kerr, a Frenchman by birth and successful San Francisco businessman, was one of the 10. By 1880, he had acquired all of the stock and became its sole owner. He and his Italian wife Maria, called Albina, had 9 children, of which 6 survived, 2 boys and 4 girls. He set upon changing the island from a modest cattle operation into a complex, integrated, self-supporting business that exported wool, sheep meat, beef, hides, livestock, feed, fruit, vegetables, and wine. Using mainly local materials, Kerr constructed throughout the island ranch houses, bunkhouses, barns, blacksmith shop, a saddle shop, wineries, and a small chapel. Pictured here is the main ranch, as it was called by Kerr, nestled in the Central Valley between the island's 2 mountain ranges. The very successful and profitable cattle and sheep operations were supplemented by substantial award-winning wine production. At its peak, 110 workers were employed, 70 at the main ranch, 10 at Smugglers, 14 at Scorpion, and 8 at West Ranch. The Chapel of the Holy Cross had been erected by Kerr in 1891. An annual Mass is still held here to this day. Members of the Kerr family are buried in the small cemetery next to the chapel. Kerr built extensive water systems, harnessing several of the island's year-round streams and springs, an incredible undertaking considering the distances and obstacles between all his holdings on the island. He constructed a 26,000-gallon storage tank housed under a roof, as well as dozens of cisterns strategically placed. For the same reasons, communication was difficult, with some outposts requiring a 12-hour horseback ride one way. In 1885, he built a telephone system wiring and connecting all his ranches and outposts. At that time, it was the largest privately owned telephone system in the United States. Communications with the mainland was dependent on the frequency of ships to and from the island. In 1896, the Santa Barbara Daily Independent ran this story. The Independent has succeeded in inaugurating a carrier pigeon news service between the camps on Santa Cruz Island and Santa Barbara. The Independent has taken the initiative in the matter and hopes to serve the readers daily letters from Cueva Valdez. If nothing happens, and if the bird crosses the water without ill effect, messages will be published each day telling happenings on Santa Cruz. The first pigeon is expected tomorrow. The next message I found of the carrier pigeons was 2 years later. Flight of a carrier pigeon from the islands. Bird crosses channel in 45 minutes with news for the Independent. The pigeon brought a message to the Independent from Cueva Valdez. The messages are written on very thin, specially prepared paper and then rolled and tied snugly, but not too tight about the bird's leg, end quote. After Justinian's death in 1897, the ranch was left to Albina, who transferred some of her stock to her children. His sons continued to run the ranch successfully for several years. Then in 1910, a long and complicated series of litigation by Kerr's 2 married daughters against their mother and 4 siblings was filed. In 1925, by court order, the island was partitioned into 7 tracts. Ambrose Guarini, one of the instigators of the legal action, was awarded 6,000 plus acres on the east end of the island. There, the Guarinis continued sheep raising operations. In 1937, to pay the substantial litigation costs, the remaining Kerrs were forced to sell 90% of the island to Los Angeles oilman Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton shifted the agricultural production and sheep raising operations to beef and cattle production. Upon his death in 1964, his widow and son, Dr. Corey Stanton, continued the business. Later, Carey made an agreement that upon his death, his interest would pass to the Nature Conservancy. Corey died unexpectedly in 1987, and the property, 90% of the island, was deeded to the nonprofit organization. Ranching operations were rapidly phased out, ending the ranching era and ushering in a period of habitat restoration and public recreation. Looking at the remaining 10%, in the 1970s and 80s, as ranching costs rose, the Guarini sheep operations declined. In 1980, the Northern Channel Islands were designated as a national park. Protracted litigation arose again. The Guarinis held up the purchase agreement for 16 years as family members insisting the government offers were too low. In the early 1990s, agreement was reached between the government and 3 of the 4 heirs, purchasing 75% of the 6,300 acres. But Francis Guarini, an Oxnard attorney, held out on his 25%, effectively blocking the establishment of the park. Finally, in November 1996, agreement was reached, clearing the way for the park to be open to the public. Putting the litigation behind us, let's take a closer look at the beautiful, rich, rugged, and diverse coastline through the following postcards and photographs. Here, a 1907 postcard pictures an unnamed island location. I believe it's an early view of Prisoners Harbor, with the sandy beach framed by steep cliffs. A closer look at the sheer ruggedness of the coastline cliffs, some rising as high as 300 feet. Of the hundreds of caves found on the island, let's explore 2 of the largest. Painted Cave's location, pinpointed by the arrow in the upper left corner of this map, is one of the largest and deepest sea caves in the world, being 1/4 mile long and 100 feet wide. Painted Cave is the second longest and one of the deepest caves in the world. In terms of volume, it is the largest. The first room from the sea is about 60 feet high, with the walls beautifully dyed by the salts into brilliant yellows, soft browns, reds, greens, and white, making it more remarkable than the Grotto of Capri. The first chamber leads to other caves, some of which, to this day, have been unexplored. The gaping cathedral-like entrance ceiling is 160 feet above the turf. Seasonally, in the springtime, a waterfall cascades over the entrance. Let's explore the interior of the cave. The second cave we'll explore is Cuevas Valdez, reached by Valdez Harbor, a craggy, dangerous approach. It's identified by the red arrow in the upper left part of the map. Originally named Tres Bocas, or Three Mouths for its three high entrances, today it is known as Cueva Valdez. Cueva meaning cave, and Valdez the name of a noted smuggler who is said to have ended his days in this cave many years ago. One arch opens on the dry sand of the beach. The middle one is approachable by boat and relatively calm waves. The third, even higher than the other two, is unapproachable by boat because of swirling currents and dangerous rocks, both visible and submerged. The lost entrance cannot be seen from the other two. The sandy floor of this part of the cave is always damp, and because of its configuration, the light is always twilight. Cuevas Valdez is one of several sites on the island used by Flying A and other movie studios. A few of the silent films include Heart of My Heart, 1912, Pearls of Paradise, 1916, Battle of Hearts, 1918, Adam and Eve, 1918, and Male and Female, 1919. The Rescue, 1928, based on a popular Joseph Conrad novel, was one of the world's first talking motion pictures filmed here. I've not had an opportunity to completely research this rare postcard from my collection, but it is most likely associated with one of two silent films, Calamity Ann's Dream, 1913, or Diamond in the Sky, 1915. The skipper at the helm is either Ira Eaton or Captain Vasquez. Paraphrasing the Santa Barbara Daily News of September 4th, 1913. 17 members of the Flying A Company went to Santa Cruz Island with Captain Vasquez aboard the Otter this morning to film Calamity Ann's Dream, one of the interesting series in which Miss Lester figures prominently. Great difficulty was encountered in persuading Jack, the burro, to enter the boat, and a still greater difficulty was anticipated in getting him to land on the other side. And from the Santa Barbara Morning Press a few days later, the beauty of the island impressed the director to such an extent that it was decided to stay over and complete the production on the island, taking advantage of the unsurpassed scenery. Miss Vivian Rich separated from the crowd and decided she wanted an ocean bath. Clad in bloomers and tunic, she was about to plunge into the ocean when from nearby rocks came the call, "Oh, you Diana," referring to Diana, the goddess of nature. Miss Rich beat a hasty retreat. From the Santa Barbara Morning Press of April 21st, 1915. Yesterday, one of Flying A Company's boarded the Seawolf with Ira Eaton at the helm for Prisoners Harbor to secure pictorial material at that point and in the interior for the great production, The Diamond from the Sky. On June 15th, paraphrased, the octopus arrived for The Diamond in the Sky. It is believed the scene will prove a success of the octopus seizing the diamond that fell into the ocean during a struggle. This was one of the most difficult stunts yet attempted for this picture, as the ordinary octopus isn't especially partial to diamonds, but the octopus was induced to move towards the gem, and that was all that was needed. Back to the cave. I've inserted this image to give a perspective as to the size of Cueva Valdez. Santa Cruz Island's beauty and diversity was a perfect location for making movies, and today it is a paradise for hikers, divers, and boaters. There are many anchorages with colorful names like Pelican Bay, Prisoners Harbor, Chinese Harbor, Potato Cove, Scorpion, and Smuggler's Coves. Let's take a look at a few as we travel along the coastline. The red arrows will chart our path. Continuing from Cueva Valdez, we will circle around Scorpion and Smuggler's Coves on the peninsula, and eventually finding our way to West Point, having circumnavigated the island. Tucked under Diablo Point lies Fry's Harbor, sheltered by the mountain. It offers a fairly safe and secure anchorage during strong winds. The Flying A Group filming Calamity Ann's Dream made the area near Fry's Harbor their base of operations. 10 years later, much of the stone used to build Santa Barbara's breakwater was quarried here. Pelican Bay is a beautiful site with its surrounding high cliffs, and in the spring, spectacular with wildflowers everywhere. Just over a century ago, Pelican Harbor was the location of Ira and Margaret Eaton's rustic resort that attracted sportsmen and celebrities from around the world. Diary of a Sea Captain's Wife, authored by Margaret, chronicles the primitive day-to-day conditions they endured while raising a child and loving and savoring every moment of their adventure. A few random comments on Prisoners Harbor and Prisoners Cove. It was the location of the Chumash village of Xaxas, the site where Vizcaino named the island upon having his staff return to him. It was the terminus of two efforts by the Mexican government to export criminals. The area became Justin Care's headquarters, which he called Main Ranch. One of California's earliest wharves was built here in 1869, and the location for kilns used for making bricks, which ended up being used at many of Care's locations. And it was the home of a United States post office for 8 years. Justinian's son Albert was the postmaster. It was named for Chinese squatters and Japanese who set up camps to fish and dive for abalone. It is a small beach with high surf. Driftwood from Santa Rosa and San Miguel Islands often end up here. Its steep cliffs serve as a protection from Santa Ana winds. I stayed overnight in Potato Cove in the boat of a friend. It provided us safe anchorage, an awesome view at the star-filled night sky, a beautiful morning daybreak, followed by a nice refreshing swim. And permeating all around us was the terrible smell of bird dew. Near Scorpion Anchorage was another of Claire's ranch houses and buildings supporting sheep ranching. 200 acres of planted vines yielding 7 varieties of reds and 3 varieties of whites, which in good years produced 95,000 gallons and averaged 42,000 gallons annual production of award-winning wines. The ranch later served as headquarters for the Guarini Ranch operations. The sheep stock produced an excellent wool, almost as fine as cashmere. Today, the ranch is the location of the island's visitor center. Smuggler's Cove is where the largest Native American village was located. In Spanish times, the cove was used to smuggle goods to avoid taxes and levies. In fact, the colonies came to depend on smugglers to provide illicit goods from illicit traders. During the 13 years of Prohibition, the cove was used for smuggling liquor, and today's booty is illegal drugs. In 2012, a tragic incident occurred in Smuggler's Cove. Two suspected smugglers on a panga boat rammed a Coast Guard inflatable boat as it was approaching them. The vessel increased speed and directly rammed the small Coast Guard boat, ejecting the two Coast Guard officers into the water, killing one. The smugglers, now turned murderers, were apprehended. This is a beautiful scene of what is appropriately known as Blue Banks Anchorage. Blue Banks is the terminus of the Central Valley, containing lush pastures for cattle with streams flowing down canyons and with several waterfalls. Frank Hansen, also known as Wildman, lived here at Albert's Anchorage in a small shack. In her diary, Margaret Eaton tells of hair-raising accounts concerning this colorful character. Years later, in 1954, the Santa Barbara Island Foundation agreed to allow operation of a diving club at this site. Carrie Stanton stated, "The club was a good idea basically, but it proved to be totally unmanageable and was disbanded after 3 or 4 years of operation." Again, quoting Dr. Stanton, "A faux Polynesian village with 6 beach huts for guests and a chef's hut for staff was constructed by hauling materials ashore." Notice the slogan here, "So you can't go to Tahiti, we've brought Tahiti to you." Separating 2 adjacent anchorages is this gigantic rock known on the charts as Hill 432. Coches Prietos on the left is Spanish for dark pigs. During the care-ranching era, thousands of sheep grazed these canyons. Today, Coches Prietos is considered the best beach on the island, getting the most late-in-the-day sun and having minimum surf. This postcard captures a typical scene found throughout the island of the sheep corralled on steep terrain. As we continue our journey westward, we approach Willow's Anchorage, where 2 towering rocks, each standing 87 feet above the water, appear to be guarding the entrance. This is a view of the mouth of Willow's Canyon, looking seaward towards the 2 gigantic sentinel rocks. Bottom right, the postcard advertises a fishing destination for guests of the Potter Hotel. In the early 1900s, George Nidever's sons built a large fisherman's cabin here from lumber salvaged from a wrecked ship. They fished Santa Cruz just as their father had hunted otter 60 years before. From 1908 to 1909, the Eatons lived at Willows. In her diary, Margaret Eaton expressed her gratitude to the brothers for the fireplace they had built. It was put to good use, providing comfort for Margaret and her infant daughter during cold, windy, and wet weather. The anchorage was frequented by Japanese fishermen whose traps were often raided and then cut loose by Frank Madman Hansen and Ira Eaton together. They considered the fishing grounds to be theirs and were not inclined to share. They were fortunate not to be caught and to have lived to tell about it. Hansen also told this story to Margaret. 3 men had chartered a boat in San Pedro to go hog hunting on the island. Laguna Harbor and beach is very treacherous, even for those familiar and having expertise at navigating to the shore. High swells lifted the boat and flipped it, dumping 3 men into the surf. The captain, upon seeing the men in trouble, jumped in and was able to save 1 man. A second man, a policeman, drowned. The third was found naked, wandering up the canyon, half crazed. In more modern times, a World War II Navy Grumman Guardian plane was on a mission in 1954 searching for a missing jet. It had engine trouble and was ditched in the water. The men made it to shore and were promptly rescued. The aircraft is now a diver's objective, sitting outside the harbor near Gull Island. The plane sits upright on the bottom in 60 feet of water, intact except for the propeller, which lies 75 feet away in the sand and is pictured here. Morse Point and Sierra Blanca are wonderful locations to view spectacular sunsets. Underwater, reefs abound with varieties of fish and a great place for invertebrates. Quoting diving expert Dale Scheckler, Santa Cruz Island is a special place in the Southern California Ocean. It is a place of transition. Currents mix, converge, and collide here in different ways depending on the season and climatic shifts. What you find at Santa Cruz Island is a mixture of temperate and cold water species of fish and invertebrates. This is the sampler platter of California's underwater world. Here, you see bright orange Garibaldi, typical to southern warmer waters, alongside bright white-spotted rose anemones that you usually only see in waters further to the west and north. Perhaps no more is this mixing pronounced than at Morse Point on the backside of Santa Cruz Island. In addition to the convergence and mixing of currents, the proliferation of life is due in part to the fact that this area has been a marine protected area for over 7 years. Scheckler continues, not only are the fish protected, but so are the invertebrates. Slow-growing rock scallops have begun to return here. Lobsters are numerous, and some are quite large. Protected even longer are the abalone, and if you're diving, look carefully under some ledges and you may spot a pink abalone or 2. Pozo, meaning water well, was named after a well was sunk in the canyon to a considerable depth without finding any good water. Kerr constructed an elaborate sheep corral system complete with a sheep shearing shed. He planted a grove of Italian cypress, possibly to shelter a future ranch house, but that never materialized. At the mouth of the canyon, a broad sandy beach extends for over a mile in length. And Pozo was also favored by the Japanese fishermen as a spot to lay their fish traps. Forney's Cove was the location of yet another of Kerr's outposts, with a ranch house, corrals, pens, barns, and other supporting structures. Forney's Cove is at the island's northwest tip and perhaps the wildest place to anchor at Santa Cruz. Just offshore from Forney's, waves, winds, and currents clash in what has been dubbed the Potato Patch. The sound of heavy surf often rumbles over the low peninsula, which forms the protective arm of the anchorage. But inside the cove, the water is usually surprisingly quiet. Fraser Point is a large rocky extension at the extreme west end of the island. Making it to shore on Fraser's Cove, also known as West Cove, is as treacherous as trying to enter Laguna Harbor. Below is the farthest west tip of the island. Our last stop, having completed our circling of this incredibly beautiful and diverse island. But before we go, I had to include this photograph of an imposing cliff near Fraser Point on the west side of the island. And also, two typical views of the numerous streams that flow year-round on the island, creating magnificent waterfalls, pools, and oases for plants and wildlife. As we close this presentation, a recent visitor gave this account. What you see, a rugged landscape of every hue, undeveloped, untouched, wild. What you hear, nothing, not a single thing but your own breathing. You inhale and the air catches in your throat. What words apply? Insert your preferred superlative here. Magnificent, spectacular, glorious. The adjectives will come fast and furious, but the perfect word eludes in the face of beauty indescribable. And another states, this is the way California used to be.